I'm going to take just a quick second to turn on my slide share before we get started here this morning to talk some farm policy together. Okay, I think we are now all set. If my colleague Jessie could confirm that you can see our slides all right. Fantastic, good deal, wonderful. Well, again, good morning, welcome. Thanks again to the MFFC team and to Brian for that wonderful introduction and for the opportunity to join you all today. My name is Sarah Hackney. I'm the Coalition Director for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And if you are here on a Saturday morning, you're in the right place. And you are here to talk with us for about 45 minutes about food and ag policy, most specifically the 2023 Farm Bill. So thanks for being here and joining us for a really nerdy 45 minutes on policy. We're really delighted to be here with you. Thanks again. So to get us started, I just want to offer a quick moment of introduction so you have a sense for who we are and where we're coming to you from today before we dive into the work together. First and foremost, and thank you all for your patience while we do the fun game of getting our slides to work. I'm going to take one quick second. Thanks for your patience while we get our slide share going. One second, folks, and thanks for your patience. We're going to, let's try this. All right, one second. Bingo, we got it set. We're going to turn that back on, and thanks again for your patience. It wouldn't be a Saturday morning presentation without at least one tech challenge. All right, perfect. Here we go. So first, who are we and where are we coming in from today? So my colleague Jessie and I are here from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. We're a Washington, D.C. based grassroots alliance of over 130 member organizations working all over the country in the field on behalf of farmers and communities working together for a more sustainable, equitable farm and food system. And the way we do that is through working to shape federal policy. I'll talk more about us and our work in just a moment. But first, let me give my colleague Jessie just a moment to introduce himself and say hello. I'll say hello as well, and then we'll dive in. Jessie, you want to say hi?
Yes, I do. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jesse Womack, pronouns he, him. I am NSAC's conservation policy specialist, working mostly on things in the Farm Bill that fall in Title II, big working lands conservation programs, and I'll talk a little bit more about that kind of language, titles, and all that a little bit later. But really excited to be here and excited to get going. So I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Awesome, thanks, Jessie. Great. So, one of the reasons we're here today is we're really fortunate to have a number of really excellent member organizations based in Michigan and doing incredible work in the field. That includes your conference hosts, MFFC. So we work closely with the MFFC team, and we help to be that voice for Michigan organizations like MFFC here in Washington, D.C. I don't know if we have any other of our members here in the room today, but I hope we do. I know there's some excellent folks doing great work in Michigan, and we're really proud to work with you. How do we do that work, and what does it look like? So again, we're D.C. based, but our whole reason for being is helping to make sure that folks in the field, and that includes farmers, nonprofits, and community leaders who care about food and farm issues, have a voice in Washington. So folks in the field like you, share your experiences, your challenges, what's working well and what's not when it comes to federal policy and programs with organizations like MFFC or at conferences like this one. In turn, those member groups listen and learn, and they bring those needs to our shared table. And so then us in that national context, we get to hear from farmers and from communities all over the country. We hear what's going on in Michigan, how that looks different in California, maybe the connection to Vermont or to Florida. And then we come together as a national organization to decide what to do about it. And then we organize and build power together to win. We know that we are stronger together. and that when we work together to identify those shared needs, we have more grassroots power and more ability to shape what happens here in Washington, D.C. And again, we act as kind of the eyes and ears here in D.C. We meet with folks on the Hill, we talk directly to USDA, and we bring the needs of folks from the field to Washington with that powerful voice for change. Sessions like this are actually a really good and big part of our work. I live in DC. I cannot know exactly what's happening and what's most important in Michigan. So we really are here sincerely to listen and to learn as well, and to understand. We have that humility. We know that you know more than we do about what your needs are. And so we want to know that so we can ground truth and make sure that our work is in line with what you need. So to that end, we've only got about 45 minutes today. So this is a pretty brief session. Think of it as an introduction to what will be ongoing conversations in partnership with organizations like MFFC throughout the next 2 years. So again, think of this quick session as a grounding, a chance to kind of get your head around what's going on, what it means for you, and how you can be involved, with the understanding that there's going to be lots of opportunities to continue the conversation together in the months to come. To that end, we've set this up as a very brief introduction. We're going to do just a little bit on the history of the Farm Bill and where it comes from. And then we're going to dive right in. What is the 2023 Farm Bill? Why is it so important? How is it structured? What's in it? What's not? Some Michigan examples to help kind of bring home how this big federal policy in Washington explicitly translates to what your lived reality looks like in the field. We'll talk a little bit about the timeline. When is Congress going to do or draft or write a new Farm Bill? Why is Michigan important in that process? And I think really importantly, where and how your voice can be heard as we do this work together. Again, this is just an introduction. We'll be pretty brief, and we'll probably be a little bit more high level with the hope and the invitation. This is the start of a conversation that can continue throughout the year. One quick note, we love questions and we welcome them. I know we're doing this very cool live streaming format with the MFFC team this morning. So if you have a question at any point, you are invited to go ahead and share it through the platform on the MFFC website. The team is going to capture those questions. We've saved some time at the end of our session today to talk through any questions you may have. There are no dumb questions here. If it's a beginner question, that's great. If you've been doing farm bills forever and you have a deeply nerdy question, we love that too. So please know that questions at all levels are welcome. There's no bad question here, and we are saving time at the end, and we'll get through as many as we can. If you think of it 10 minutes in, go ahead and drop it in. And again, please know that we've held that time at the end, and we really look forward to tackling any questions you may have. We are here to be a resource and to help you feel more informed and engaged and empowered for the work that is to come. So with that, I think we're ready to dive in. I'm going to kick us off here with just a moment or two, maybe 2 to 3 minutes on some historical context for the Farm Bill that we think is really important. And then I'm actually going to hand it over to my colleague, Jessie, for an extra nerdy, wonderful deep dive on some nuts and bolts about the Farm Bill. And then it'll come back to me to talk a little bit about how you, no matter who you are or where you are or what you do, have a voice in this process and how and why you can be effective. So with that, let's start with just a little bit of history. I find this helpful to re-ground in before we go into the nuts and bolts. So the Farm Bill today, we're in the year 2022, Congress is going to rewrite it in 2023, is what we call a piece of omnibus legislation, a large multi-part bill that contains lots and lots of programs, policies, and funding. And again, Jessie's going to talk us through what it looks like today in just a few moments. But something that's really interesting to note is actually the original Farm Bill dates all the way back to the Dust Bill. The original series of bills that became the Farm Bill were enacted in the 1930s as part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal legislation. The Farm Bill came about as a means to address two concurrent problems: rock bottom prices for farmers due to overproduction and really extensive hunger and poverty both on and off farms across the country. Early farm bills also sought to tackle the catastrophic erosion and soil loss we saw due to drought and poor land stewardship. You see that really iconic Dust Bowl photo on your slide right there. Lack of credit options for small farmers, really chronic rural infrastructure needs, and much more. Those historic origins and their roots all the way back in the 1930s can actually still be seen in the outlines of new farm bills today. When we look at some of the biggest pieces of the bill that really focus again on sort of managing production, managing for nutrition and food access, and thinking about land conservation. Those remain today the three biggest components of the bill, and they date back to that historical context. It's also really important to name here, and I think this is important just to have us all be reminded, those early farm bills, while they were aiming to address important issues, they also in many cases explicitly included individuals from access to the kind of support they needed. Most specifically, people of color, Black and Indigenous, and farmers of color nationwide were often left out of or explicitly excluded from the programs that white farmers had specific access to. It directly contributed to generations of land loss and to displacement across the country. This is important to name because we see the contours again of that historic exclusion, discrimination today in the structure of the bill now. You don't have to look hard before you see the many places where that early racism that's built into the bill is still remaining present in the structures of our current farm and food policy. For example, we'll talk a little bit more about specific programs in just a few moments, but even today, right, it's still harder often for farmers of color, for smaller scale growers, for diversified growers to access what we think of as some of the building blocks of building a successful farm business. Access to land, access to capital or credit, so the money that you need to run your business, access to conservation resources. We still again see contours of differences in ability to access and ongoing discrimination. It's also important to say that advocates and farmers have been working really hard to redress those harms and to fix that policy for a long time too. And we do that work. There is an enormous coalition and cohort of incredible organizations working nationwide to make those shifts. And so I think that's also important to name. This is work we're doing collectively, and we can welcome your help in to shift and rethink how the Farm Bill works and how it can better serve everyone and advance the important cause of racial equity in our farm and food system. So we can get into some specific examples as we go. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well when we talk about sharing your voice. The kind of takeaway here on the historical front, again, is history is still with us. It is not ancient. It is not forever ago. A food and farm system here in the US built on stolen land and stolen labor and built with early bills that explicitly excluded folks from support is still work we're trying to undo and to redress today. So with that, hopefully that little brief historical context gives you a little sense of where the bill came from and can inform what it looks like today and where we're trying to go with it going forward. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Jesse.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. After that kind of historical piece, yeah, we're really going to dig into a little bit of, what does the modern Farm Bill look like? What are some really important things to keep in mind when you're thinking about it and thinking about, what's in it and advocacy around it? Right off the top, the Farm Bill is a massive omnibus piece of legislation that is rewritten every 5 years. So the most recent Farm Bill governing farm programs across the country was passed in 2018 and will expire at the end of 2023, which means that we all need to be preparing to edit the Farm Bill kind of right now. The process starts well before the deadline for the bill's expiration and is in fact sort of already underway. This is a really big bill. It spends over $400 billion in federal money, which is very, very significant. And that level of spending, really can produce the kind of patterns that Sarah was talking about in the front half of the presentation. The bill is really expansive. An omnibus piece of legislation means that it's sort of cobbled together from dozens of other bills, each touching on unique topics and aspects of the food system. And we've kind of laid out here on this slide, elements of the food system that the Farm Bill can impact. I'm not going to read them all, but just know it's big. It touches a lot of things. We're going to add a little bit of detail as we go. Next slide. Okay, so what does the Farm Bill really do? Almost all of the Farm Bill is what is known as authorizing language. So authorizing language is bills and laws that kind of create or modify programs and then designate federal agencies to actually implement and run those programs. So for example, the Farm Bill might create a program like the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and then designate NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, to implement that program. When these bills do this, they can offer really specific guidance for agencies in their activities, or they can leave things a little bit more general and sort of charge the agency with figuring out the details. Sort of depending on the topic, legislators might take one tact or the other, but they have the power to do both. Even when legislators opt to sort of cede power to the agencies, they almost always at least kind of give them guardrails to sort of direct their action. This can kind of take a lot of different forms, and not a minor portion of this is determining how long a given program will run. So is it a one-year pilot program? Is it something the agency is responsible for the life of the Farm Bill? That's something that's often established in statute. A really important part of authorizing legislation is the funding behind a given program. So there are kind of two big buckets of funding that a program can receive. One is known as mandatory. This is something that's kind of baked into the authorizing legislation, and it's considered pretty durable. If you have mandatory funding for your program, that means it's going to be there every year. That is stipulated in statute. This is a little bit different than discretionary funding, which is written into authorizing legislation, but must ultimately be released by appropriators. And that's kind of a separate process handled by a separate committee in Congress. The Farm Bill creates both pools of fundings for programs. So it's really important and kind of a strategic consideration for folks like us when we're thinking about, how much support does a given issue need. The Farm Bill also includes language about who can use a given program. This covers eligibility criteria and often determines, which types of producers are allowed to participate, which types of farm practices can receive support. So in my world, this includes like the Conservation Stewardship Program. Is there a cap on how much funding you can receive through this through this program? What kinds of conservation practices can you receive support for implementing within this program? Those kinds of things. Some of that gets haggled on again at the agency level, but again, big broad rules for the program set in statute. The Farm Bill can also establish priority status for participants in specific programs. CSP and EQIP, for example, have a designated pool of funding for what USDA refers to as socially disadvantaged farmers. And this includes BIPOC producers. So there is a specific set of funds for folks that want to use those programs where they can access it without competing against other growers. In the case of grant programs, the Farm Bill also determines things like the maximum amount of the award, the length of the grant, and other things like whether matching funds are required, and any restrictions on administrative expenses or uses for the funding. So you can really do a lot just in that authorizing language. Next slide. As Sarah mentioned, the kind of history of the Farm Bill is alive and well in its structure today. The Farm Bill is organized into usually about 12 titles, and you can see here some of the history Sarah was talking about. Title I, commodity programs, Title 11, crop insurance. Those are the kind of premier programs that go towards supporting farm production. Title II, conservation. You know, those are sort of long-term, long-standing program or titles. And NSAC works on a good number of these, not all, but they're all very important and all worth attention. Next slide. What is not in the Farm Bill? Everything listed here. And while these issues are all directly related to agriculture, they're not included in the Farm Bill because they fall outside of the jurisdiction of the agricultural committees. So the Farm Bill is kind of exclusively a product of the Senate Agricultural Committee and the House Agriculture Committee, and therefore it can only include topics that those committees have jurisdiction on in the eyes of Congress. So for everything listed here, somebody else is in charge of passing those laws. For example, farm worker rights and protections fall under the jurisdiction of the House Education and Labor Committee and the Senate Health, Education, and Pensions Committee. Next slide. This is just kind of a breakdown of where all 400 billion of the Farm Bill dollars actually go. You can see here that the nutrition title is the vast majority of the funding, a little bit over 75%, with crop insurance, commodities, and conservation making up the majority of the rest of the spending. Everything else is about 1% in that little black sliver at the top. So while there's really significant work happening and really important programs in that other 1%, this is kind of like a really important thing to keep in mind, that like the big spending things and often the hot button contentious political things around the Farm Bill kind of stem from these big buckets of money. Next slide. And I threw this slide in here just to sort of illustrate why we see some of those big spends in commodities, crop insurance, and conservation, kind of speaking to the history that Sarah laid out at the beginning of the presentation. We've used Farm Bill programs to really prop up corn and bean production in this country. That's the yellow and the dark green sort of across the center of the US here. It's an absolutely massive system that has privileged a small amount of landholders comparatively. And you know, this is what it looks like on the landscape. And this is sort of the reality of that spending. So I include this in here just for context, just to show, you know, how big that has gotten. Next slide. And I added this slide as well to show that Michigan is very much a part of that, or the results of those long-term big spending decisions show up here in Michigan as well. Lots and lots of corn and bean ground, lots and lots of evidence of sort of, yeah, these long-term structural inequities built into the Farm Bill. Next slide. All right, so who writes the Farm Bill? I mentioned that the Senate Ag and House Ag committees have jurisdiction. So it's legislators on those committees that are really in charge of drafting up the Farm Bill. Each chamber of Congress, and so therefore each committee, drafts its own separate version of the bill. And they're often doing that sort of simultaneously. There can be some back and forth behind the scenes. Legislators will try to work ahead of time to make sure that there's no, you know, unnecessary fights over discrepancies in the two versions of the bill. But the processes are still separate, and eventually those bills need to be reconciled to get us a final Farm Bill. The whole process starts when the Senate Ag Committee and the House Ag Committee begin hosting their own hearings This has already been happening. The House Agriculture Committee has hosted a couple Farm Bill specific hearings here in Washington, D.C. In the last month or two. So like I mentioned before, the Farm Bill process is very much already underway. People are really starting to dig into this. Members of Congress use these hearings as opportunities to hear from expert witnesses on all of the issues that Farm Bill covers. And this very much includes farmers. We've had a number of farmer panels on the House Ag Committee speaking to issues that matter to them already this year. It's a very important part of the Farm Bill process for folks to get onto those hearings and really make their voices heard to members. The House and Senate Ag Committee also review the legislative policies and priorities of other members of Congress who are not on the committee. These ideas ultimately show up in the legislative process as marker bills. And marker bills is sort of a specific word we use here at NSAC to talk about bills that aren't meant to pass on their own really, but have kind of only been introduced into Congress for the sake of getting swept up in the Farm Bill process and ultimately written into the Farm Bill. They are really, really, really important. They can be the most effective way to introduce a new idea or improve an existing program. And we spend a lot of time working to create marker bills and build congressional support for those individual bills ahead of the Farm Bill process. So again, I mentioned we're not needing to pass a Farm Bill until the end of 2023, but we are very much drafting marker bills right now and talking to member offices right now about which bills they're willing to champion or which ideas they want to see introduced in a marker bill. Next slide. This graphic just kind of lays out the process that I was describing. You've got the House Ag Committee on the left and the Senate on the right, kind of running their concurrent bill writing processes. Eventually, there's a conference committee where both the House and Senate need to come together and iron out differences in their bills. Once this happens, the bill can go to the president's desk and it becomes law, and we have a farm bill. For those of you that have been through this process before, you know that it is rarely this simple, and there are lots of opportunities for this process to be completely derailed and for delays to happen. But in a perfect world, this is how it unfolds. Next slide. And I included this just as a reminder that for y'all in Michigan, you happen to have a very, very influential member of Congress involved in this process, Chairwoman Debbie Stabenow of the Senate Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee. Chairwoman Stabenow is one of the most important legislators in the Farm Bill process. So if y'all have the opportunity at any point in the next 2 years to tell Senator Stabenow what you want to see in a Farm Bill, that's a very important activity to engage in. And I'm sure Sarah is going to elaborate on that a little bit more. Next slide. And I think this is the end of my presentation. What's coming for 2023? As I mentioned, we're working on marker bills already. We're monitoring testimony and hearings. We're working with legislators to get marker bills and ideas introduced into the Farm Bill conversation so that we're really well positioned to get the changes we want to see when it's go time. But there's tons of other kind of grassroots organizing work that needs to happen as well. And I think that's where Sarah's about to take us.
Thanks so much, Jesse, for giving us that 101 walkthrough of some of the structure and contents of the bill and what it looks like and how it's going to move forward. So what does that mean for you? Where and how can you be involved in this process? How can you shape it? That's going to be my job. I've got just a few minutes of thoughts on that to kind of help you feel prepared and engaged. And then we're going to be really excited to hear any questions that you might have. So again, friendly reminder, if you've got a question, No dumb questions here. We love them all. Go ahead and drop them in via the live stream, and the MIFS team is going to collect those for us, and we'll have a little time at the end for Q&A. So again, if you've had a question, drop it in. We're looking forward to tackling it in just a few moments. But first, let's talk a little bit. So with that understanding that this is an enormous opportunity, a really big bill with a lot of moving pieces and a lot of really, really fundamental structural components of our farm and food system. And the most important senator who will take a lead role in drafting that bill happens to represent Michigan. How can you be heard? How can you be involved in this process and help make sure that this is a good bill and the best bill that we can make it right now? So first and foremost, we get none of this without grassroots organizing and without taking the time to raise our voices as part of the process. You may have noticed, if you've spent a little time looking at the news anytime in the last 20 years, Congress and USDA don't exactly always move with a lot of speed, and they aren't always doing all that they can to represent the needs of growers. That's not always the fault of the folks who sit into Congress or who sit at USDA. They're big institutions with a lot of red tape, a lot of complexity, and a lot of power that moves through them. Our job as folks in the field, again, is not to say, it's not to give up and not to say, oh, they'll never care. It's to say, we know there are people who care in Congress and at USDA, and our job is to make sure that we're telling them what our needs are and that we're putting as much pressure on as we can to help get the outcomes that we need for our communities. So our job, again, is to speak up and to say what our needs are, to share our good ideas, and to press them and give them that information and that pressure to act in the way that we need to see for changes and results in our communities. We only get those changes by doing that work together. I can tell you, as someone who has been in Washington for over a decade and who came to this work from community-based work on the ground with growers, and who comes from a background of not a wonky background at all, it's hard work and it's long work. We're here today and we're working to build on the wins and the hard labor of folks who've been doing this work for years and years, decades, and it will continue long after us. So we don't think of it as our responsibility to get every single answer right now. We're going to get as much as we can, as far as we can together over the next few years, with the understanding that we're all doing this work together and it's long-term work. Now, if you're anything like me, you might be thinking, well, it sure feels really important to build a more equitable food system. It sure seems like we don't have time to wait on the climate crisis. I share your sense of urgency around that work, and I encourage us to channel that urgency to get as much positive grassroots pressure as we can throughout the next 2 years, so that this next farm bill is a significantly improved and reformed farm bill that's going to help us build a more sustainable, equitable farm and food system, and that's going to help us really meaningfully address the climate crisis that is already well upon us. How can I do that? Let's talk just really briefly about it. This is our time to really be doing 3 things: to be listening and understanding what's going on, where do my lawmakers sit on certain issues, to be learning about the issues and how you can be involved, and then really importantly, to be sharing your voice when the opportunity arises. So let's talk briefly about that. First and foremost, if you're new to this, it's no shame at all. We all were new once. Here's a couple of great places to start. Take a moment to refresh your memory. Who are your representatives? Who are the people in Congress who are serving you? Every single one of you has 2 senators and 1 representative in DC. I've included a handy reference link for where you can look them up. Have a look, double check. Who are they? And do any of them sit on those committees that Jesse mentioned, the House Ag or the Senate Ag Committee? If so, your lawmaker is going to play a disproportionately large role in shaping the Farm Bill. If you're interested in this work, you want to get some great news updates, I've also included a few references here for places you can go for reliable news and information on food and ag policy. Welcome more suggestions in the chat or on the question box as well. Now's a good time to start listening. As Jesse mentioned, lawmakers are trying to figure out, what do I do right now? What issues should I support? So they're going to be looking, one, they're going to be talking about their priorities, and two, they may have opportunities to be hearing from you. On that first part, if you're not yet subscribed to your lawmakers email newsletter, if you don't yet follow them on Facebook or Twitter, this is a good time to get plugged in so that you can be doing that listening to understand, is my lawmaker paying attention to ag? And where and how can I shape what she or he is thinking? Now's a great time as well. As we get into that listening and learning work, there's going to be opportunities for you to speak up. These are getting going, and they're going to be in motion very significantly over the next couple of years. So let's talk about a few ways you can. First and foremost, I want to talk, I think, especially about that sharing perspective tab you see here. There's going to be a couple opportunities. Jesse mentioned hearings. Congress does formal hearings where they invite farmer witnesses to speak. Also, they may be doing listening sessions or what they call field hearings this summer. It could be that there's one in Michigan or one in your state where you have a chance to show up either in person or virtually to testify or to share your story with lawmakers. Encourage folks to consider attending those if they come to your community. MFFC is a great partner for this. You can count on them to communicate about those opportunities and to support you in that work. Examples that are really especially helpful to share from folks in the field for lawmakers include, are you experiencing barriers to accessing federal support? Have you experienced discrimination or difficult paperwork or other challenges? It's good for them to know that, because then they can work with us on trying to develop a solution. If you had a success story, this is actually important too. Not everything is always bad news, though there's no shortage of it. If you've had a good experience with a program or an opportunity, we also have to do the good work to protect what is working. So if it is working, sharing that success story is really helpful. It helps us build support to protect what's good. And again, ideas for improvement. If you have an idea, a bright idea, MFFC is a great place to bring that idea. NSAC is a great place to bring that idea. Other organizations in the field. Now is that time to share ideas, so we have a hope of getting them included in the next bill. I said it here and I said it earlier. Equity is an important consideration here, and we're especially keen to understand how that looks in the field for you, whether that's barriers to access or opportunity or disparities in outcome. That's especially important for us to be hearing and sharing with lawmakers so that we can address inequity in this next bill. Finally, just one more quick little couple of tips from me before I answer. It looks like we have some great questions, which is very exciting. Let's talk just one more moment about how can I, as a regular person in the world, influence my member of Congress? If maybe you're on this session, you're not a farmer, and you're a nonprofit advocate or a community leader. A couple other tips for you here. Introduce yourself. Every single member of Congress has a field team. They have field staff. It's all been very remote for the last few years due to COVID. That's starting to shift. Get to know those folks, introduce yourself, stop by that office, send an email introduction, make sure they know who you are and what you're up to. Invite them to your farmer's market, to tour your food hub, to a workshop or a celebration. Let them know who you are and what you're doing and what you're proud of. Did good news happen in your community? Did you secure a federal grant? Did you receive federal funding for something you're proud of? Tell your lawmaker's office, get on their radar. Again, that's a really tactical, simple way to help them know what you're up to and why it's of value. And then finally, I mentioned earlier, showing up really matters right now. There should be both virtual and in-person opportunities over the next 2 years, whether that's a field hearing, potentially a lobby day in Washington, D.C. We might want you to come to Washington with us. These are really big opportunities, and I cannot emphasize enough how much they matter and how important they are. There's no shortage of highly paid lobbyists in Washington, D.C. We have our work cut out for us to lift up and to elevate grassroots voices on an equal plane with the really well-paid teams of lobbyists here in D.C. We take that work seriously. It is very important, and we would love to have opportunities to work with you in making that happen. So with that, I'm going to pause here because this is time for some Q&A, and it looks like we have quite a few good ones, which is awesome. So let me take a moment to read these out and we will answer if y'all. First question. Yesterday's sessions went in depth on land back for tribal members and land access or reparations for Black farmers. Are there any Farm Bill programs specifically working to address this? That is a great question. The short answer is, yes, but not as comprehensively as could be done, and there's more opportunity here. So just to give you a few examples, there's a number of marker bills out right now in the field that are explicitly oriented toward opportunities to essentially get prioritized land access and land repatriation to both Indigenous and Black farmers. Again, there's legislative work and development right now that's intended to be part of the Farm Bill for that work. It's not yet law, not yet a full program, but it's ideas that people are working on for the bill. So there may be opportunities to support that kind of legislation in this next cycle. So yes, that's definitely important and underway. There are also some programs in the Farm Bill right now, including programs like CRP TIP, Conservation Reserve Program, Transition Incentive Program, that prioritize, Jesse's like, yes, you got the acronym right, that prioritize the sale or transfer of land to beginning and socially disadvantaged farmers to incentivize landholders to transfer their land to those kinds of communities of farmers. So if you'd like to follow up offline, definitely shoot us a note and we'd love to connect you to some specific opportunities. But the short answer is there are ideas in motion. We hope to see more activity in this cycle. Can farms be member of our coalition? Generally, our request, we encourage farms to be members of their state-based or regional organization like MFFC and hold representation in NSAC through a state or regional entity. Our organization is primarily set up for membership from nonprofit organizations. But again, we encourage you to be a member of an entity like MFFC or MAFA in Michigan. And then in turn, you can access opportunities to be involved in policy through that connection. Great question. What is the best form to use to get my thoughts to Congress? Is it best to email, call, snail mail, or something else? I have a thought, but Jesse, you might have a thought on this too. COVID has changed this. So first and foremost, my answer is always any channel is better than no channel. So the channel that is most available to you and accessible to you, anything is better than nothing. Historically, in the before times, pre-COVID, we would say phone calls are the best. That's because congressional offices know what you know to be true, which is it takes a little more work to pick up the phone these days than it does to send a quick email. And so they weighted or considered phone calls to be a more significant sign of commitment or energy from the field. With COVID, many offices have been remote, so they are inconsistent in answering their phone. If you're not scared of the phone and you like to call, I still encourage giving it a go, but please know you may hit a full voicemail, you may hit a roadblock, and if that's the case, both regular mail and email are completely fair. Another thing that's an underrated opportunity that I would encourage you to think about is actually meeting your field staff for the representative and senators who represent you in DC. So actually finding out, where's that office? Is there a person I can contact there who might reliably forward my input to their DC team? Jesse, any thoughts to add from the policy team perspective on that one?
The only thought I'll add is on top of no channel or any channel being better than no channel, multiple channels, if you have the time and energy for it, is also great. Members of Congress are very, very busy folks with lots of things coming at them all the time. So just the more touch points that you can get to sort of remind them that your issue is important, that can be really, really impactful. It's a harder lift on your end, but if it's something you do have the time and energy for, strong encouragement.
Awesome. So we've got a couple more questions, and these are really good ones, and I know we have to end on time. So I've gone ahead and moved our slide to some opportunities to stay in touch with us. So one quick question, this is a big one, so I'll offer a thought, and Jesse, I'll invite you to as well. What is the NSAC team anticipating to be the biggest roadblocks for the upcoming Farm Bill? There will be many. I will give you a few. One, funding. There may be a set or a capped amount of funding that the Farm Bill can spend. If we are working with what we call level funded or capped farm bill funding, there's going to be fierce competition for where and how we prioritize that funding. And that will make it really tough to prioritize new programs or new initiatives, because again, that money will have to come from somewhere. So funding will be a challenge and a fight. The coming electoral cycle, we may see a shift in congressional leadership after the fall elections, and that will shake up the deck on who is writing the bill and who's influencing it. And then Jesse, I'll invite you. Actually, I want to ask this last question real quick. So if you have thoughts, we'll get to we'll get back to you. One more question. I would love more information on resources for less privileged farmers and farmers to be or would be farmers. That is such a great question. Thank you for asking that. A couple of quick thoughts with a caveat that we're short on time. First and foremost, the Farm Bill does contain programs and initiatives that are especially oriented toward both beginning or would-be farmers and what USDA calls socially disadvantaged farmers, which is inclusive of farmers of color and in some cases women. A couple of things. First and foremost, I actually encourage you to talk to your MFFC team. They know really well the landscape of which programs work well and are oriented that way. NSAC's website has a free resource called the Grassroots Guide to Farm Bill Programs. We have tagged every program at USDA that offers a set aside or a prioritization for farmers of color, and it's a really helpful resource to browse. In addition, as we dig into the next Farm Bill cycle, if you have ideas or needs specifically oriented toward less privileged farmers or beginning farmers, I strongly encourage to take those ideas to the MFFC team so they can get them to us and we can integrate them into our Farm Bill asks. So that's a really important question and a really big priority for this cycle. And that's that. Please stay in touch, find some input on our slide, and I think we have to wrap up. So Jesse, if you want to say adios, this was a pleasure. Thank you all. We're excited to be in touch in the next 2 years. Stay tuned for more.